Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be discussing social change in the 1960s. The 1960s, from previous lectures talking about Vietnam, is definitely a time of great domestic upheaval. There's college campus protests going on. There's been the assassination of Martin Luther King, and the civil rights movement is changing and becoming more radical. You see the assassination of Robert Kennedy, and so there really is this quickly changing dynamic within society, and so today we're going to spend some time discussing that. One of the first groups of people that are going to be demanding change that we're going to talk about today are Native Americans. Native Americans in the United States are kind of the forgotten about minority, which is very, very sad because, Native Americans, they were, the indigenous people in America, and we can talk about, all through American history. Natives have just, they've had their land stolen from them. They've had treaties broken over and over again, which is something that will definitely will play a role later in the 1960s, with lawsuits and such. But they've been, the Indian Wars, and the devastation from disease that Europeans brought with them to America. The native population by the 1960s have essentially been decimated. They've been moved onto reservations. The Jackson administration, Andrew Jackson, he, with removal policy, really kind of took the surviving Native Americans, that's the groups that survived the Indian Wars, and pushed them out west, and really gave them some of the worst land to have to live on. And the result of that ended up being that the Native Americans are actually the worst off minority group in America, and which is something that most Americans don't even recognize. They're the poorest ethnic group in the United States. They have the highest unemployment rate. They have the highest illiteracy rate, and they have one of the highest alcoholism rates in all of the United States. And so Native Americans are suffering today. They were suffering in the 60s as well. And so they're going to form an organization called AIM, the American Indian Movement. And AIM is designed similar to the Black Panthers. It is one of those, if the Black Panthers are, Black nationalism, then the aim is a Native nationalism, essentially, right? And they're going to be established to try and, protect Native Americans from, police brutality, and to advocate for Native American causes. And they're really going to be pushing for justice over the broken treaties that America has, broken all over the course of history. And if you go back to, some of the very first lectures, there's all kinds of treaties that we have broken with the Native American people. And so AIM, because they are a paramilitary group, right? You can see in the picture above that they are armed. 200 armed AIM members are going to take over a couple of different areas in the United States and occupy them. One of them is at the hamlet at Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee, obviously, being a symbolic battle from the Indian Wars. And they're taking over these territories to protest all of these broken treaties. Another place that they're going to take over is going to be Alcatraz. They're going to take over the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, and several other government buildings. And all of this is being done to protest those broken treaties, and the fact that that land used to be legally owned by the Native Americans. And so it's drawing attention to their cause, trying to get people to recognize that the plight of the Native American is needs to be essentially addressed. And so they're not just going to challenge the status quo by occupying these territories, because that's not going to get a whole lot accomplished, right? We can't have armed takeovers of federal territory, although it did draw attention to the issue. Where AIM is going to be most successful is within the court system. And the court system in the 1960s was very supportive of the civil rights movement. It's also going to be supportive of the Native Americans' legal challenges to these broken treaties. That through a series of court cases, Native Americans are going to win about $40 million in essentially payments for these broken treaties. I'm going to be clear with that. That sounds like a lot of money, but I mean, Andrew Jackson essentially stole the state of Georgia from the Cherokee, right? And so is that worth $40 million? No. Are we ever going to give back Georgia to the Cherokees? Of course not. That's not possible. And so $40 million is a step in the right direction, but it's definitely hasn't solved the problem for Native Americans overall. I'm sorry, I said $40 million. It's 40 million acres of land back and a total of $900 million. So I apologize for that. But $900 million and over $900 million and 40 million acres of land back. Again, that's not enough for that's definitely not enough to make up for the land that was taken from them in the violation of those treaties. But at least it's it is something, and it's recognition that yes, we did in fact break those treaties. Now, to give you historical context, because this is in no way, shape, or form justification. It is completely wrong to break these kind of treaties or to remove Native peoples from land. But that is a pattern that we see with almost all modern countries, that indigenous populations have been removed over time. So anytime you look at any kind of government or ethnic group that's in one spot of land, almost assuredly that group of people aren't the original people from that land. And so this is a pattern that you see throughout history all of the time, is the displacement of people. It is something that we recognize today is bad, and we try our best to stop the displacement of native peoples. And and modern Western societies in particular are trying to make amends for that. I don't know that you can actually ever fully make amends for it. As a matter of fact, I'm certain you can't. But it is at least some recognition that that part of our history is definitely a shady part of our history. The next, and so what we're going to see is, as far as Native Americans and Native American treatment goes, we're going to see a shift in policy with the Nixon administration. And so, the original Native policy under George Washington was kind of just an assimilation policy, right? And so George Washington said, like, look, you just need to start acting like us. Now, that didn't work because the American population never really let the natives assimilate. The Cherokee are a really great example of that. The Cherokee, they had their own constitution. They spoke English. They were in the South and practiced the plantation farming, and they even owned slaves. I mean, at the time, that was pretty American for the South, and we still kicked them out. So we didn't really allow Washington's assimilation. Then we had Jackson. Jackson was a removal guy. He was like, look, I like the natives. I want them to survive, but they're inferior to the American population. And so if you want to survive, anytime the two come into conflict, the American civilization dominates the native situation. And so if the natives don't want to go extinct, they need to remove themselves and head further out west. And so Jackson had removal policy. He moved them out west. By the time we get to Eisenhower, the Eisenhower's policy sounds awful. It's termination policy is what it's called. It doesn't mean terminate like exterminate. It means terminate like stop being Native American. It's essentially a assimilation policy. So Eisenhower goes back to a modified assimilation policy. Nixon, when he comes into power, he actually renounces the policy of termination. And again, that doesn't mean kill. It essentially means assimilation. And what Nixon actually does, and this is one of the things that, Nixon's a shady dude. There's no doubt about it. And we'll talk about that in the next lecture about the Nixon impeachment. There's no doubt he's shady, but he does accomplish some decent stuff. And one of the things is he starts to recognize, you know what, the termination policy is bad. We need to respect your rights to live the way you want to live. And so he renounces termination. He expands federal aid to Native Americans. And he says, you know what, you guys on your reservations and on your land, you should have self-determination. Essentially means you should be able to have your own government that's outside of the purview of the American government. Now, it's not completely outside of the purview of the American government, but it is mostly outside of the purview of the American government. And that's why, you always hear about like Native American on Native American reservations, there's gambling in states that don't allow gambling. Well, why is that? It's because the reservation system has self-determination. They can make up their own laws regarding those kind of things. And so again, Nixon moves the country a step closer in the right direction to make up amends for the way we've treated the Native American population. So even though Nixon, totally shady guy, does do some good stuff, and this is one example of them. I think kind of normalizing relations with China is another one. All right. The next group of people we're going to talk about is women. Women, right? The women's lib movement has been going on since Abigail Adams was, advocating for women's rights during the foundation of America, right? Women have had to overcome the idea of the cult of domesticity, that a woman's place is in the home, that she shouldn't be involved in work or politics or anything like that. Made really slow gains. The women's movement essentially was put on hold in favor of the abolitionist movement, right? Women looked around and they said, look, America will only accept so much change so quickly. And so in, the 1800s, women, for the most part, not all women, there are a lot of advocates for women's rights in the 1800s, but most women said, you know what, we should focus on abolishing slavery. Then after that, we can focus on our rights. And so that's kind of how it unfolded after the 1860s. And, African Americans were freed from slavery and the men got the right to vote. The focus then became on women's liberation. By 1920, we get the 19th Amendment and women get the right to vote. And so they've got essentially political equality. And then in the 60s, it's, we want to not be discriminated against, right? And so there's this fight for equality of the sexes. And so by the 1960s, we're going to see the rise of feminism. So feminism, and it's a real complicated issue because, different people define feminism in different ways. So the modern definition of feminism is a little bit different than the original definition of feminism. But in the 1960s, the original definition of feminism is just the belief that women should have economic, political, and social equality with men. Now they're talking about equality of opportunity, right? So women shouldn't be discriminated against is basically what it is, right? They should have the opportunity to work any job that a man works, right? They should have the ability to belong to any kind of club that a man can belong to, that they shouldn't be kept out of holding office, and those types of things. And so we really start to see a rise of women want a law that says, just like African Americans wanted a law that says that they can't be discriminated against. And so that's what they're going to start to push for. And so they start to really question their role in America. Remember, these women, and this is very important, right? These women are breaking from the cult of domesticity, the idea that their place is in the home. Well, why is that? Why all of a sudden, you got to remember, most women for most of American history believed in the cult of domesticity, that a woman's job was in the home and she shouldn't involve herself or wasn't in. And most women believed they weren't capable of involving themselves in politics or man's work, right? I mean, like World War II, we had to have a propaganda campaign, Rosie the Riveter, telling women that they're actually capable of doing a man's factory work, right? I mean, that's how much we had to literally spend all kinds of money to convince them that they could do it. So why is this generation in the 1960s, why all of a sudden do they reject the cult of domesticity? Well, again, it goes back to World War II. Their mothers and their grandmothers, right? They lived without men during World War I and World War II. Their mothers, the women that are advocating for equality now, they grew up with stories about how mom took care of the home and fixed the toilet and got a loan for a house and was able to deal with the bank and had a job in a factory and did all of that while her husband was overseas fighting. And so these women have been raised in houses where they've seen their mom be capable and actually do the things that that women had for most of American history been told that they couldn't do. And so these women just naturally kind of reject the cult of domesticity. And they recognize that society hasn't quite caught up with that yet. And so, they feel like they've been subjugated and essentially ignored throughout. Their political voice has been ignored. That while they were protesting the war, that the leaders of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement essentially were telling the women to like sit back and take a back seat to the male activists. A lot of times they were told you don't get a leadership role. You can be the secretary, but you can't lead the march. And women were starting to get frustrated with that. I mean, Martin Luther King even, and Martin Luther King is my favorite historical figure. I mean, I love the idea of judging people on the content of their character and not on the color of their skin. But just like every historical figure, we're all human and we're all kind of flawed. And one of the ways that Martin Luther King showed some flaws is the way he interacted with women. And so and an example of this is Martin Luther King Jr. was a preacher, and so people came to him with life advice and things like that. And one of the things that Martin Luther King said to a woman who was, asking for advice about her cheating husband, Martin Luther King asked that woman, do you spend too much time with the children in the house and not pay enough attention to him? Are you careful with your grooming? Do you nag? And essentially implied that your husband cheated because you weren't doing enough to keep him faithful. I mean, like today, are you kidding me? Like, do you nag too much? Do you do you put on enough makeup to make yourself look pretty? Like that's the reason why, your husband stepped out like that. That's ridiculous. But I use this as an example, and Martin Luther King is an example in particular to show you how ingrained this kind of this kind of sexism was, the guy that you think of as the most tolerant guy in America, Martin Luther King Jr., he had some of these prejudices. And so these women are going to be fighting that and fighting those stereotypes. And they're going to see improvements, and one of those improvements is going to be the signing of the '64 Civil Rights Act, right? We talk a lot about the Civil Rights Act and how it improved life for African Americans, but the Civil Rights Act doesn't say it's illegal to discriminate just on race. Right? There are other categories that are included in the Civil Rights Act. It actually says no discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, or gender. You can't discriminate. You can't not hire somebody because they're a Catholic or because they're Black or because they're an immigrant or because they're that's right, woman. And so this is a huge step in the right direction, right? The idea that now that women have the right to vote, they have due process because of the 14th Amendment, they have the right to vote because of the 19th Amendment. So they had legal equality in the court systems, but they didn't have protection against discrimination in the workplace or in social clubs or things of that nature. The 64 Civil Rights Act says no more discrimination there. And so that doesn't mean true equality of outcome. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. Everybody is in America at this point is equal under the law, right? The law has to treat everybody the same. And so you have equality of opportunity in America, right? So everybody has the opportunity to go to the same school. They can't tell you can't go to school because you're black or public school because you're a boy or a girl or because you're Catholic. Private school is a little bit different, but the public stuff, you can't discriminate there. But that doesn't mean that's not total equality, right? That's equality of opportunity, right? Equality of outcome, and we'll be talking about this later with the Equal Rights Amendment, is a totally different thing. Because if you have equality of outcome, that doesn't just mean that boys and girls get to go to school together and whites and blacks get to go to school together. That's equality of opportunity. Equality of outcome means that not only do they get to go to school together, but they all have the same outcome, which is the same grades. And so, clearly in the United States, we reject that idea. We say, no, everybody should have the same opportunity, but then you rise and fall on your own merits. And so this idea of, the no discrimination, that gives you the equality of opportunity, right? The opportunity to get a job. Now, how well you do on that job depends on what you do while you're in that job. So huge step in the right direction, but it's not going to be enough for some within the women's movement. And I say some, I do mean a minority of the women's movement. Now, if there is discrimination, the 64 Civil Rights Act actually provides an enforcement mechanism. That's the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So if you're not offered a job and you have proof that it's because you're black or a woman or an immigrant, you can go to the EEOC and the EEOC will sue on your behalf to get you that job or get you a payment, a payout for that discrimination. And so the women's liberation movement, an organization now, is going to, we'll talk about now in a minute, they're going to use the EEOC to really try to, push discrimination out of the workplace mostly, but in other areas of society too. And they're going to use it very effectively. And it's going to really help open up a ton of opportunities for women. And I got to tell you this, because I have to point it out. This is great for everybody, not just women. And here's the evidence for that. What we know is that the most economically successful societies in the world all have one thing in common. They are the ones that give women the most rights, period. Right? I mean, that's it. And so if you want to be economically successful, right, what you have to do is you have to allow women as many opportunities as men have. And so everybody in America, and this is very serious and it's been studied by all kinds of economists, everybody in America is going to get richer when women start to go to work and are able to bring home a paycheck. Everybody benefits from that. And so this is a huge step for not just women, but for the American economy in general. Right. So again, the EEOC handles workplace discrimination claims. You go to them and they'll sue your employer. Initially, it was used for African Americans, right? And so because that was the big push for the Civil Rights Act, but because of the organization, the women's liberation organizations and groups like now, what we're going to see is the EEOC will really start to push for women's equality as well, equality of opportunity. All right. So women in the workforce, again, great for the economy. In 1950, we got 33% of women. 33% of women are in the workforce. By 1960, we're going to see that it shoots to over 40%, and that number will steadily rise over time. Now, again, it's slow. Right? I mean, you don't get change overnight. So at first, it starts out mostly clerical, retail, teaching, nursing, kind of the standard historical jobs that were reserved for women, kind of, more low paid professions. But that will eventually change over time. And so, what we're going to see is that there is going to be a presidential commission on the status of women that is going to be created to try and discover, what is the situation, how are women being treated, what can we do to help, figure out, how to fix these things. And what the commission finds out is women were being paid less for the same work within the workforce, and so there was a discrepancy in pay. They weren't promoted as much, and they rarely made it to management positions in these fields. Now, the commission that checks the status of women, this is, today is really controversial. We talk about today all the time about the pay gap between women and men, and it is more complicated than what it was in the 1960s, right? In the 1960s, there was some, because women were just starting to enter in a lot of these other fields, they were getting paid less than men because employers could use the fact that they didn't have as much experience to drive down wages. And a lot of that driving down of wages was done purposefully. Now, over time, that has started to change. And so if you look at the research today into the gender pay gap, and there is a gap, right? Men generally, if you take a male engineer and a female engineer, for every dollar the man makes, the woman engineer is making. The number changes and it fluctuates over time. It's somewhere around 80 cents. Overall, if you don't do apples to apples with jobs, I think it's men make $1, women make like 77 cents. But you try to compare apples to apples, and it's a man for every dollar a man makes, a woman makes 80 cents. But that's still not necessarily a fair comparison, because what the research is showing today is, in general, the male engineers work more hours than the female engineers do. And so there's, how much of a gap, once we go true apples to apples and oranges to oranges, that number shrinks. We're not quite positive what that gap is. There's lots of controversy on that topic. People get really upset about it. But what we see, there's lots of research being done in the Scandinavian countries that have gone really far in passing laws to make sure that men and women get paid exactly equally. And that research is coming up with some interesting findings about choices, and interesting results in why there's a gap. Because in the country that has done the most to legally require the pay gap to shrink, the pay gap's actually increased. And so there's some interesting results there. If you're interested in that topic, I would suggest you go to Google and type in gender pay gap Scandinavian research. It's really pretty interesting. But in the 1960s, there's for sure employers that are using the fact that women are entering the workforce to drive down wages, and that's historically pretty accurate. I mean, it's very similar to what employers did with African Americans, during the Great Migration, to drive down wages as well. I think East St. Louis is a really interesting example of that in the early 1900s. And so we're going to see that the issue is not just about equal pay. We're going to see that there's going to be a change societally as well. Women are going to start to make claims about clothing, like that wearing high heels are sexist. They were invented by a man to accentuate legs and butts and breasts by the way that it makes you posture. that mini skirts are slave clothes for men, which I mean that ignores the history of how mini skirts were developed. During rationing during World War I and World War II, skirts got shorter because we were conserving resources. But I mean, it does sexually objectify women, and there's a really good point there. There's going to be this movement for women should be able to wear pants, which I think is like today we feel like of course they should be able to wear pants, right? And so we're going to see a push for that. There's also going to be there's going to be this like kind of myth of the burning of bras. There were actually very few protests where women got together and actually burned bras as symbols of oppression, right? To accentuate, the idea was it accentuates the breasts, and it's super uncomfortable, and that we should burn our bras to show our commitment to female liberation. And it did happen, and there were people that did that and were very serious about it. That wasn't your average woman, however. Most women continued to wear brasiers. And so this is kind of more scandal. I think the media played this kind of protest up more than it actually was impactful in society, because it just makes a good story. But it does kind of become a symbol for the movement that we're not going to. Society tells us we have to wear this thing that's really comfortable, and like, well, why? It doesn't make sense. Our breasts serve a biologically important purpose, and so they don't need to be sexually objectified. And I think there's a good argument to be made there. And so, as the movement pushes on, there's going to be, some real talk about, well, because of things like the gender pay gap, there's going to be talk about these, turning a little bit more radical. And we're going to see conscientious movements springing up across the country that are going to be a little bit more in your face. I love this billboard here. If it were a lady, it would get its bottom pinched, right? Advertising in the 1950s was wildly sexist. Go watch an episode of Mad Men, right? And these movements, right? If this was a lady, she'd run you over or run you down. I like, that's great. I find that to be super hilarious. And so it's these groups that are really going to start to push for an equal rights amendment, an actual amendment that says men and women should be treated equally. Now, initially, there's going to be a lot of support for it. And, most women are going to support an equal rights amendment. But in reality, society will reject the equal rights amendment. It will not get passed. It's going to go back to that difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. Because we've outlawed discrimination, what that means is women, in fact, do have the equality of opportunity. They have the opportunity. They can't be discriminated. They can't be told that they can't go to the public school down the street. They can't be told they can't have that job. They can't be told that they can't participate in this event or whatever it is. And so they have that opportunity. The Equal Rights Amendment is something different. It's actually talking about equality of outcome, right? And so true equality under the law. And so, as this is building steam, there's some people that really start to question, well, do we really want the government to enforce equality? Or do we want them to enforce like equality of outcome? Or do we just want everybody to have the same opportunity to do it on their own? And so, it really starts to become a national debate. And it's going to be this woman here who's got a new show on Hulu right now, Phyllis Schlafly, who is going to actually lead the resistance to an equal rights amendment. And so now what you might be thinking is, why would a woman lead resistance to the equal rights amendment? Well, she's going to point out a couple of things, and a couple of things that are going to cause some pause within society and with women. What she's going to ask, a simple question is, do you really want to be totally equal? She says, and makes some good points, like, we got to be careful here. There are certain certain things, certain rights that women have enshrined in law that maybe might go away if we pass an equal rights amendment. The number one thing, the first thing that I think everybody should come to mind is, well, who serves in a draft? Right? We just had the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is going on in the 60s. And so as the Equal Rights Amendment is being pushed through, the Vietnam War is in the forefront of everybody's mind. Who's eligible for the draft? Well, right now it's just men, right? Well, if we pass an Equal Rights Amendment, guess what? Now women are eligible for the draft. That's equality, right? There are other things that have essentially been enshrined through case law, right? Through the court systems. If a man and a woman in the 1960s, in 1970s, get divorced, who typically gets the children? The courts do favor women in that situation. The men can get it sometimes, but the woman's got to the man's got to prove that the mom has done something pretty serious to be able to get that. It's not equal. It's not, the husband gets one and the wife gets another, or which, I mean, that's Solomon. That's not going to happen, right? But the idea that they have to equally consider a man over a woman, that all of a sudden is that really something that you're willing to consider? And so Phyllis Schlafly starts to point these things out that maybe that's not what we want. And then, if you're really talking about equality and you start talking about, does that mean that a business has to hire 50% men and 50% women? And now, if you think about that for a second, you start to think, well, maybe that's not a bad thing. But what if, what if men don't want to be ballerinas? And all of a sudden now does the employer have to look around and say, okay, well, I want to hire the best ballerinas, but I've got 4 female ballerinas and I've got 2 male ballerinas, and a really good female applied and a crappy man applied. Do I have to hire the man to make my company more equal? And so there's these questions about what does it mean, and that is a pretty extreme interpretation of the Equal Rights Amendment. But I mean, when you put in the law a thing that you have to treat people equally, all of a sudden now that opens up that opportunity that all of a sudden now you take away people's employment choices, you take away those kind of things, and that gets a little scary. And so with the 64 Civil Rights Act, essentially what it says is both a man and a woman have the right to apply for the job of being a ballerina, but the boss has the ability to pick whichever one is best based on their ability, as long as he doesn't just say, no, I'm only hiring women, right? Or no, I'm only hiring men. And so, that Phyllis Schlafly makes those points, and you're going to see, large portions of females start to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, Phyllis Schlafly is also going to have very traditional views of what it is to, be a woman, and she's going to say super controversial things about, like, oh yeah, these women that want to go work in a factory or whatever, they're going to become lesbians, and there are those kind of like radical kind of statements and implications. It's not necessarily actually things that she says, it's things that she implies as well. And so, she is going to be very rabidly traditionalist, and she has some viewpoints that I find to be kind of, backwards. But she does make some points about, do you really want to be eligible for the draft? Because, most likely if you pass an Equal Rights Amendment, you're going to have to accept that women are going to be eligible for the draft, and that you won't get favored treatment in the court system for during a divorce and custody of kids and alimony, and she even makes implications about do you have the right for, women at this time, or, abortion is a huge issue. We'll talk about Roe v. Wade later. If it's equal rights, and, she makes it, she starts to question about, well, would men then have a say over whether or not you can have an abortion? And again, that's a radical interpretation, but it's a question, and it's a question that nobody really has an answer to. So she opposes the ERA, and eventually will get it will eventually get the ERA killed. Just recently, because Congress has to pass it, and then it's got to go through the states. And so Congress did pass it, but it didn't meet the threshold for the certain number of states. It just recently, actually, I think Virginia, I'm just saying that off the top of my head. I could be totally wrong here. But I think Virginia just passed it, and that put it over the threshold of the number of states that need to pass it to make an amendment. But it did it. There's a timeline, and so they didn't do it within the number of years that are required for it to pass. So the Equal Rights Amendment will essentially be killed. So what we're going to see is the women's liberation movement. It's going to have a number of things that they support and a number of things that they are going to reject. One of those is sexual objectification, right? That's the bras and the short skirts and the high heels. Sexual competition. Women shouldn't be putting other women down. I think that's a thing that women still talk about today, and I think is really important. And we shouldn't be competing over the interest of a man, right? Let them compete over us, kind of deal. Beauty pageants, again, that's the sexual objectification. Female passivity, right? Don't just sit back and wait for a raise. Go ask for it. Don't let your husband, just overtake you. Make sure that you become assertive. Mindless supportiveness of your husband, right? You shouldn't, like the cult of domesticity, always support your husband, always, be there for him. And it's like, well, that's dumb, right? My husband isn't always right, so I shouldn't have to support him when he's not right. Now, of the leaders of the movement, one of the first leaders of the modern women's liberation movement is going to be Gloria Steinem. She's a journalist. She really comes to the forefront of the scene. She writes an expose on the Playboy Club and the treatment of the waitresses at the Playboy Club. Playboy Club is not like you hear Playboy and it's yeah. The Playboy Club, the waitresses are just in bunny costumes. They are sexually revealing, but they're not. I mean, it's not a strip club. But she goes in and undercover as a waitress there and writes about her experience and the sexual objectification there, and really makes her kind of this national figure. She will co-found Miss Magazine, which is going to be pushing women's liberation movement ideas. And then the real leader of the movement is going to be Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan is the intellectual leader. Gloria Steinem is kind of the face of the movement, whereas Betty Friedan is the brain behind the movement. And she's going to write a book called The Feminine Mystique, which is, one of the most popular books in America. And in the book, she says that it addresses the problem that has no name. And so she writes a book talking about women and, kind of what they're experiencing and the dissatisfaction of women in the 20th century. And so she's saying, look, women in, the 1900s, middle 1900s, 1950s, that they are dissatisfied just being a mom, that they're dissatisfied in the home, that there's a hole that they want to fill. And she essentially says that the average woman isn't satisfied just being a wife and a mother, that they're depressed, and just being a wife and a mother is causing all this kind of unhappiness and depression amongst women, and all of that gets written about in The Feminine Mystique, and millions of women read it and they say, you're right, I have this feeling, I've been told my whole life that the only thing that is important is being a wife and being a mother, and that all of my happiness should be there. And if I'm, raising my kids right, I'll be happy. And if I'm not happy, I'm not a good mother and I'm not a good person. And they read this book and they're like, thank you for telling me that I'm, that there's nothing wrong with me. And so it's very liberating for most women, or I shouldn't say for most women, because there is some controversy here. It's very liberating for a lot of women, and it's a very important message for a lot of women. There will be some critics of the feminine mystique, and so even though it sells millions of copies and all kinds of women relate to this message, and I would argue is a very important message for women to hear, right? Some women might be fulfilled being a wife and a mother. Some men might be fulfilled being a husband and a father, and you should have the freedom to do that. But you shouldn't be pigeonholed into that. Right. And so, maybe that's not what is going to make you happy as a woman. Maybe you want a career, or maybe you don't want children. And you shouldn't feel bad for that, and that's what the feminine mystique does, which is incredible for women. They need to hear that message. Throughout all of American history, women are told the opposite of that. They're told that all of their happiness should come from being a wife and being a mother, and if that doesn't make them happy, there's something wrong with them. And so we know today that that's not the case, and for some women it is, but for some women it's not, and you shouldn't feel bad if you want something more than a wife and a mother. And so that's really important. Now, there are some critics here, and I think it's important that we talk about this, because the feminine mystique essentially implies that all women, or most women, aren't satisfied being a wife and a mother, and she implies that the book is based on what she claims to be scientific research. That research is pretty flawed. She does this scientific survey, and she does do a scientific survey, but she is only surveying students from Smith College. Well, this is a pretty progressive female university. Well, so why is that not scientific? Well, because think about it. Why would you be going to college in the 1960s? Well, it's because you want to have a career, right? You go to college so you can have a career. And so these women are inclined to say, no, of course, being a wife and a mother isn't enough for me. I've been spending, I'm in school to be an accountant or a teacher, or, whatever it is. And so, yeah, of course I want more. And so to be a true survey, you've got to take a random sample of the entire population. You got to get you've got to include the people that, aren't just college students. And so the implication is, Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, implies that this is applicable to everybody, which isn't the case. It's not. The research is flawed there. But that doesn't mean it's any less important. It's still important because it does tell women, and there are a whole bunch of them out there, and today I would say probably the majority of women out there that want more than just a family, and the feminine mystique tells them that that's okay. And so, even though the book's not necessarily completely scientific, it still is a very important piece. So that leads us to the creation of the National Organization for Women. Now is co-founded by Betty Friedan. The idea is to pursue a women's agenda to help women with the things that are necessary. Childcare is super important. The men already have jobs, and so if you have a kid, the childcare has been put on the mother's shoulders, and so childcare becomes super important because it allows women to, if you have access to childcare, you can get an education, you can get a job, and you can fulfill that need that you have. It also means if you have a job, you have freedom to leave a marriage. If that marriage is abusive or bad for you, it gives you freedom, it gives you options. And even if you're in a loving marriage, I can tell you right now, I'm in the middle class very specifically because I live in a 2-income household. And so, the fact that childcare is going to help more families reach the middle class because we're going to have more dual income households. And so they're going to be promoting childcare. And it's going to be the organization that really pushes the EEOC to stop gender discrimination and not just racial discrimination, right? And remember that from the 64 Civil Rights Act in the beginning of this lecture. Now, just to point out that how ingrained some of the stereotypes against women are. Even the movement, the women's liberation movement, is going to have participate in some stereotyping and of women. So there's no doubt about the women's liberation movement, the brains behind the movement, and the real push, intellectual push, and the person who's going to get the most stuff done is going to be Betty Friedan. But during the time period, if you watch the evening news, and the face that the women's liberation movement really puts on the movement is going to be Gloria Steinem. Why? Well, Gloria's a model, right? And isn't that kind of the antithesis of what the movement is about? I mean, sexual objectification, right? Now, I would make an argument it's just good advertising, right? I mean, if you want to reach the most people, there's a way to do that. And so I don't necessarily think that it is hypocritical, but it is something to point out, and something that I think is still ingrained today. I mean, when you look at images on TV, we're getting better about that, right? I mean, there's mannequins and the plus size mannequins and plus size models in places now where we're moving away from that kind of objectification. But even the movement in the 60s is responsible for some of that objectification as well. I just think that's a really interesting thing to think about. Not that I necessarily think it's wrong, right? I mean, I don't really have an opinion on that, but I think it is an interesting thing to think about. So, what are the women's movement goals? Well, anti-discrimination laws, 64 Civil Rights Act, Equal Rights Amendment, that's not going to happen. The abortion, that is going to be an important thing for women. And the idea is this, the responsibility of raising children falls on women. And so if, I shouldn't say it's pretty easy, but if a man gets a woman pregnant, he can kind of leave, and then the economic burden is placed on the woman. So they make an argument that women should have some control over that. There's also, it's my body, it's my choice, push there as well. And again, I'm not commenting on pro-choice, pro-life here. That's beyond my pay grade. But the women's movement makes arguments that that access to abortion is something that women should have a right to. Equal pay for equal work, that's still a hot topic today. Certainly more complicated today than it was in the 1960s, but definitely is going to push for that and makes very serious advancements. And then the prosecution of abusive husbands, and this idea that men should be more sensitive, they're going to get some of those things. They're not going to get all of them. Some of them they'll get to a certain degree, some to a lesser degree, but really is going to kind of push America towards better treatment of women for sure. One of the last things we're going to talk about is Roe v. Wade, and that's access to abortion. That will ultimately end up being a court battle. It's in 1972. Norma McCorvey, who filed suit under the name Jane Roe to protect her, filed a lawsuit in Texas where abortions had essentially been criminalized, and she's going to claim that, very controversially, her lawyers will claim that as part of her constitutional right to privacy, she has a right to an abortion, and she's going to take it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to agree with her. And so states can pass laws that regulate abortion, but they can't just outright ban them. That this is still a constant battle in the Supreme Court today. The Supreme Court has recently started to allow some more restrictions on abortion, but Roe v. Wade is still the law of the land today and is going to open up the possibility of abortion around the country. Now, interestingly enough, Norma McCorvey, after she has an abortion, actually changes her mind. She actually is a pro-life advocate today. She says that she was, in the 1970s was wrong, and so she has problems with the morality of it today. But for the women's liberation movement, this is a big win for them. Right. So, 73, the court rules that it is unconstitutional to ban the unconstitutional state law that banned abortions except to save the life of the mother. And so it opens up abortion across the country. So there are reasonable restrictions that states can apply. And like I say, those restrictions, it seems like the Supreme Court today is allowing those restrictions to get tighter and tighter. So, but it is up to the state. So there's some states where there's very few restrictions, and there's some states like Texas, Mississippi, where they're very restrictive. This Supreme Court decision is probably the most controversial Supreme Court decision since Dred Scott. It's a hot topic issue today. It's at the forefront of every presidential election. It's, how will this president influence the Supreme Court? How will they nominate justices, and how might that affect Roe? It's super controversial still to this day. And what you see, the country is really split 50-50. Half of the country is pro-life, that includes men and women, and half of the country is pro-choice. Now, last thing we're going to talk about today is the conservative counter-revolution. We talked about this before, kind of with Nixon and his silent majority. The idea is the Nixon and a whole lot of other Americans who aren't necessarily like opposed to change or rights for Native Americans or women, but a lot of them, or African Americans, a lot of them are just tired. They're tired because they've been living through the Korean War, they've been living through the Civil Rights Movement, and all the violence that was perpetrated against the Civil Rights Movement, the anti-war protests of Vietnam, the draft, the Vietnam War itself, the AIM and the women's liberation movement, and there's like all this change, and there's just a portion of America that is just like, oh my God, like I just want normalcy, I just want law, I just want order, I want to turn on the news, and I don't want to be bothered. And so we're going to start to see this movement against all this upheaval and all this, what they're going to view as chaos. The conservative revolution, and who Nixon as the leader, is going to portray hippies and civil rights activists as, as criminals, as agitators, as people that are just stirring the pot for their own personal gain. And Nixon is actually going to be able to use this to get himself reelected. And so there is a strong portion of the country that's just, maybe they're not completely unsympathetic about these causes, but they don't like the extremism of the protesting and all of that has disrupted the normal flow of society. And so there is this other movement that I think we got to talk about. Okay, that's it for today. I appreciate your time. Have a good day, and I will see you soon.